3,000 of you subscribe, but only about 200 are getting notifications, so click the bell and click all. Once upon a time, before knights fought with demons, before battle, before war, and before the sun, there was a great city at the top of the world, built of ice and starlight, full of elegant palaces, shimmering statues. It was home to a people whose splendour we are not given to understand. Clad in starlight and snowflakes, they lived a life of bliss, eating thin delicacies, toasting each other with wine made from the night, and loving each other like the sea beneath the ice. They named their city Polaris, for it stood atop the world like that guardian star stood atop the sky. It was an enchanted age, that single night. The stars spun at their command, drew rainbows through the ice, painting the air in red and blue and white and shadow. Between the star shadows the people danced with the stars, each other, to the tunes of the Empyrean, and in the dances they smiled, for the stars were beautiful, they themselves were beautiful, and their queen was the most beautiful of all. The people in that age did not yet measure time, for they did not yet know fear. Who can say how long it lasted? Perhaps it was merely a moment, melting away as breath melts a snowflake, passing even as it was born. Perhaps it was forever until it ended. Does it matter? Or is the thing the memory that lingers? I have a big game collection. And my groaning shelves aren't the only collection that I have. I have a lot of PDFs. So recently I realised that I just wasn't reading the PDFs. And I also realised that getting games that I have on PDF printed and bound at Lulu was often cheaper than just buying the hard copy from whoever happened to produce the book. And if I bought the PDF, then the person who made the game was still getting more money, by and large, than they would have gotten if I bought the game in hard copy. So I have been printing out a lot of games that I own from PDFs into hard copy. And Polaris was one of the first ones that I decided to do this with. Only 15 years after it was written, I think. It was one of those indie games coming out of the Forge that people raved about back then, and I always liked the idea of it, I always liked the presentation of it, but somehow I just had too much other stuff to do, too much other work, and so on, and so I never got around to it. And I'm still in love with the idea of Polaris, but not the actual game, which is a bit disappointing. There is a lot to commend this game, except the game part, and that is kind of the problem, isn't it? It's a GMless game, except that there's not really any such thing as a GMless game. If you get rid of the traditional role of the games master, then something else has to take its place, which is typically other players, but it could be a particularly structured form of game, it could be random tables. I've dallied with GMless games, and to compensate for the lack of the games master, I've always made them a lot more structured, and that seems to have worked by and large. Also, it helps if you make them more competitive, so that people have a reason to do things and to try and beat out the other players. Which is of course more difficult in a role-playing game than a board game, because role-playing games are by their nature cooperative. The art in the book is simplistic but provocative and good. It reminds me of the work that an artist I've collaborated with, Raven. It reminds me of the work that she's done, and you can see the cover. And that's pretty much the style that continues through the book, and it really works and helps to evoke the setting. The setting itself is this mysterious city in the far north, presumably the most northern point possible, that exists in a sort of dreamlike, mystical elder age. It has a feeling similar to a lot of Finnish folklore or other Scandinavian folklore, and I'm in love with pre-Christian folklore of Europe as a whole, but particularly the sort of Scandinavian area stuff. So this really pushes my buttons in a lot of ways. It's whimsical, it's strange, it's fantastical, it's not really something that you're used to. The setting itself is really evocative and tragic and powerful. So there is this dreamed of place in the far north, and then the arrival of the sun, the dawn, starts to melt it away and to corrupt and change and burn things out. Perhaps not so subtle allusion to climate change, perhaps. And players take on the part of knights, not necessarily just knights, but the emphasis is on knights, as it's a chivalric fantasy, who stand against this inevitable corruption and destruction of their beautiful city, and of themselves, and of the society that has been built up around all this. The sun changes everything, and it's really kind of hopeless, because really no matter what you do, you are going to end up sinking into tragedy and death or corruption. You become a demon, be swallowed up. It's a bit of a downer, which is a strike against it for a lot of people who play escapism in order to feel joy or a power that they don't have in their lives. As a more conventional game with an unconventional setting, I think this could have been a lot better. But as it is stuck and hampered by its GMless nature. There is no real direction to the game. And when you do get rid of the GM, you do end up with everyone being the GM. It doesn't lessen the amount of work. It multiplies it by however many players you happen to have, because everyone has to be the games master. Everyone has to have some kind of input into the narrative. And many people who are good games masters do not make good players, and many people who make great players do not make good games masters. So to make the game really work, you're going to need to have 4 talented games masters, because your character is not your own entirely, and you do not inhabit your character. You inhabit a meta level, a story level, similar to my objections to Apocalypse World, where you're kind of on the outside viewing what your character does and negotiating their place and what they do within the story with everyone else at the table who has control over your narrative, but not necessarily in a way that is the world reacting to what you do, but just however these other players happen to want to interfere or to shift the story. But there is no real overarching story. It's more like a series of vignettes or fables, but there's no real structure to it. So it's aimless. It needs that direction that a games master can bring, that a talented storyteller or narrator can bring, and instead it spreads it out and places a high risk that one of the players just isn't going to be up to the task. And it really needs 4 players, no less, no more, 4 players to work. For a simple system, you will likely only ever be rolling a single d6 for anything that you do. It is surprisingly complicated in ways that more traditional systems aren't. There are key phrases, there is its own peculiar glossary that is unfamiliar even to people who are incredibly experienced in RPGs. It relies on these key phrases such as, "Long ago the people were dying at the end of the world, but hope was not yet lost, for," character name, "still heard the song of the stars. And so it was. But that all happened long ago, and now there are none who remember it." And then there are phrases for conflict, "but only if, and furthermore, it shall not come to pass. You ask far too much. It was not meant to be. That was how it happened. It was no matter. We shall see what comes of it." And so on. In a traditional game, the Games Master takes the lion's share of the issues around the rules, negotiations around the rules, has the authority to make rulings on the interpretation, and much like a lot of poly relationships, all I can really see is a lot of potential problems, more opportunity for conflict and discord and disagreement and falling out with people over the rules. Your characters, protagonists, are not really your characters, they are characters that you present in play. Again, this is this kind of meta level storytelling that just doesn't engage me, and I figured out it's why I don't get on with a lot of story games. It's because I want to inhabit the character and play and embody within a reactive world and experience the world through the character rather than at the level of a narrator. You know, this is why I write books. that scratches that itch. It's why I write stories. You define your character, well, kind of, your protagonist, sorry, through themes and aspects. These are kind of skills or things particular to the setting, membership of particular orders, and so on. And you use these to negotiate in play. Whenever you get into conflict, it's not like, okay, I have such and such stats, such and such a skill, this determines my chance of success. Rather, these are chips, essentially, that you can use to bet and negotiate with the other players. And it's the involvement of other players and what happens to your character which I think really cripples the game and really fails to allow it to work. And it increases the amount of complication to an intolerable degree. So, like I said, you don't really have much to define your character with. Some aspects, a handful of statistics that don't really describe very much. But for such a simple game, this is the character sheet. It's a mess, and it's really rather complicated, and the game doesn't play like anything else that you've had much experience of unless you've played a lot of story games. And each of these sections is actually run by someone else at the table, and therein lies the problem. If you've ever played Wraith, Wraith has a mechanic, or a way of playing called the Shadow, which was a brilliant idea in theory, but in practice didn't work out so much. It was meant to be played by another player, and it was their job to be a dick to you. But there was only one other player whose job it was to be a dick to you, and that was generally the player to your left. In this, every other player is there kind of to be a dick to you, to put problems in your way for whatever it is that anyone happens to decide that your character does or gets involved in, and you get very little say over your own character, your protagonist, what they do, where they go. And so it's a mess. It's a jumbled, virtually unplayable, I would say, mess, with far too many opportunities for you to fall out with your gaming group, get into arguments, with nobody able to make a final sort of ruling and have any sort of final say over what goes on. And if you reach Deadlock, even the bidding system and the rolling system isn't really going to resolve it. So at the end of the day, what we have is a directionless, storyless story game, which only ever gives you vignettes and glimpses. There's no overall arc. There's nobody to tell the overall story. It's just aimless wandering in what is otherwise a fantastical world, mediated by a system that doesn't give you direction and creates too much opportunity for out of character conflict between you and the other players who are supposed to be your friends, who you're supposed to be working together with to overcome in a traditional RPG. So it's appropriately enough a bit of a tragedy of a game. So much promise, so much character, so much artistry in the presentation and the world, but so little useful, playable substance behind it. You should have written a book. Style-wise, I can't really fault it for what it is. It knows what it is, it knows how it wants to present itself, and it does that with aplomb. There are some issues, like for like words, night with and without a K being transposed, and other editing problems. I don't know if the more recent PDF version's any better. So for what it is, it presents itself exquisitely, so I would give it 5 out of 5 for style. In terms of substance, there isn't really a game here, there isn't really a story here. It's a directionless, meandering mess. But the information that it gives you about the world and the city and the knights and everything else could be really useful if you want to transpose it to a different game and use it as a setting for something else. The sort of tragic horror nature of it might perhaps lend itself to a more esoteric Lamentations of the Flame Princess sort of game, perhaps. So it's useful as a resource for ideas for other games, and to games designers as a resource for minimalist presentation, which I'm keen on. So substance, I can really only give it 2, which gives us a total of 7 out of 10, or 3.5 out of 5. $10, which is the current PDF price, is probably a little steep for something that you're probably not going to end up playing or using. But if you are a games designer or an art director for another game that's being constructed, or you want some inspiration for something really kind of esoteric and weird, intensely characterful and tragic, then maybe it's worth a punt. Zang. Postmortem Studios sells a wide variety of stock art, well over 500 pieces, many of them by RPG industry veteran Brad McDevitt. These are available for you to use in your personal or professional projects, whether stories or games or anything else. Check us out at rpgnow.com.